On October 27th, 1962, the world was, quote, one word away, end quote, from nuclear war. The Soviet Empire had nuclear missiles in Cuba 90 miles off of America's shores. Celebrated historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called it, quote, the most dangerous moment in human history, end quote. But no one, not even Arthur Schlesinger Jr., knew the Cuban Missile Crisis was so dangerous that the survival of our entire species depended on a single word. In 1997, at a conference to commemorate the 35th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was officially revealed that Vasily Arkhipov had saved our species from extinction. Vasily, a brigade captain on a Russian B-59 submarine, commented on his own role on that fateful day in October 1962. The submarine Vasily was in was under fire. Vasily commented, "The commander could have instinctively, without contemplation, ordered an emergency dive. Then, after submerging, the question whether the plane was shooting at the submarine or around it would not have come up in anybody's head. That is war." Vasily was explicit. The Russian commander of the B-59 submarine had every right to fire a nuclear-tipped rocket and start a nuclear war. It was being fired upon. Those are the rules of war. We were always told that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, our leaders acted cool, calm, and collected. We were taught it was because of our leaders we were able to avoid nuclear destruction. Instead, we find out that our leaders had no idea how close the world came to destruction. And the only thing that prevented nuclear annihilation was one word from a submarine brigade captain. Yet, a declassified top secret document shows very clearly that our leaders in Washington believed nuclear war was inevitable. In a report by Dean Acheson dated June 28, 1961, Dean Acheson wrote, nuclear war was, quote, unavoidable, end quote. Dean Acheson was former U.S. Secretary of State, a top planner for foreign policy, and a direct advisor to President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dean Acheson wrote in his 1961 report that the U.S. should, quote, convince the Soviets by the extent of our preparations and of our commitment that we have determined to go to the use of force, including nuclear war, rather than submit, end quote. In this document, Dean Acheson goes on to mention nuclear war or nuclear warfare 22 different times. In Dean Acheson's eyes, war was eventual, and eventually nuclear war was going to be our last resort. And in fact, Dean Acheson wrote, quote, to resort to nuclear war, comma, rather than submit to Soviet demands, end quote, was the U.S. objectives in terms of nuclear warfare. That we would watch the world blow up rather than be known to submit to Soviet demands and Soviet communism. It's clear that the American empire hides its true intentions. The American empire hides itself. It hides itself in our education system, in our culture, in our political system, in our mass media, in our institutions. And the U.S. empire hides itself in our daily lives. Now, to be clear, the American empire does exist. Yet, if you are American with a Western education who subscribes to Western media, it's extremely hard to discover that America is an empire or that you are currently part of that empire. We can't even view basic history like the Cuban Missile Crisis without the American empire hiding itself, lying about itself, and whitewashing history to fit a different narrative. I want to show you that anyone can penetrate the empire's veneer, discover the true motivations and influences behind the American empire and its foreign policy. This is Lights, Camera, Empire, Media Analysis, and the American Empire. What is an empire? In his book Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said described an empire as, quote, a relationship, formal or informal, in which one state controls the effective political sovereignty of another political society, end quote. In other words, to rule a distant territory. That's what an empire comprises. Edward Said continued, quote, imperialism is simply the process or policy of establishing or maintaining an empire, end quote. It is a curious thing that not only in our education system, but in our system of mass media, we see very little instances and references not only to empires and imperialism, but their exact definition. When our founding slave owners talk about America, how do they describe it? In the introduction to the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton writes, in reference to the Constitutional Congress, quote, you are called upon to deliberate on a new Constitution for the United States of America. The subject speaks its own importance. Ellipses, an empire in many respects the most interesting in the world, end quote. Alexander Hamilton wanted the members of the Constitutional Congress to understand the Constitution would bind this empire together. Alexander Hamilton went on to say, quote, the fabric of the American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people, end quote. Alexander Hamilton described the American empire as, quote, an immense empire, end quote. In a letter in August 1788, George Washington didn't call America a republic or a democracy. George Washington called America, quote, a nascent empire, end quote. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to James Madison in which he said, quote, we should have an empire for liberty as she has never surveyed since the creation, and I am persuaded no constitution was ever before so well calculated as ours for extensive empire and self-government, end quote. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton both knew the Constitution would be the glue that held our immense and extensive empire together. President Teddy Roosevelt was a believer in empire. He wrote, quote, I am a believer in the fact that it is for the good of the world that the English-speaking race in all its branches should hold as much of the world's surface as possible, end quote. This sentiment was shared by President Taft. In his book Year 501, Noam Chomsky wrote, President Taft had foreseen that, quote, the day is not far distant, end quote, when, quote, the whole hemisphere will be ours. In fact, as by virtue of our superiority of race, it already is ours morally, end quote. President Taft was not reinventing the wheel. Actually, his racism was rather commonplace. Thomas Jefferson explained the whole hemisphere was ours to rule by right and virtue, echoing exactly what Taft said. In a letter in 1786, Thomas Jefferson explained, quote, Our Confederacy must be viewed as the nest from which all America, North and South, is to be peopled. End quote. How are we supposed to build this great empire? Well, in 1751, Benjamin Franklin made this observation, quote, "The prince that acquires new territory, ellipses, or removes the natives to give his own people room, ellipses, may be properly called fathers of their nation." End quote. 30 years later, George Washington made a similar point, almost acknowledging that he was the father of this nation for that reason. Washington wrote in a letter in 1783, quote, "The gradual extension of our settlements will as certainly cause the savage as the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape." End quote. George Washington was knowingly or unknowingly admitting exactly what Benjamin Franklin had described, that by using power, empires acquire wealth and resources, and those that wield the power become the fathers of the nation. Actually, the point of an empire was perfectly described by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to James Maury in 1812. Quote, "We believe no more in Bonaparte's fighting merely for the liberty of the seas than in Great Britain's fighting for the liberties of mankind. The object of both is the same, to draw to themselves the power, the wealth, and the resources of other nations." End quote. You could even say that we should not believe America's righteous claim of democracy and human rights. In fact, what America wants is what the British Empire wanted, what the French Empire wanted, and that is to draw to themselves the power, the wealth, and the resources of other nations. That's what all of the founding slave owners wanted. What they wanted, what was to be gained from an empire: power, wealth, and resources. An empire allowed for vast material resources and domination through conquest. The American empire has acquired both vast material resources and domination through conquest. Yet this is exactly what the American empire hides. We are not taught America is an empire. We are not taught that America pursues material interests and that it gains domination through conquest. We are not taught it pursues two main foreign policy objectives: conquest and material interests, oil and domination. In fact, the real reasons for many of our wars have been oil and domination, material interest and conquest, resources and strategic power. A State Department memorandum shows our government had a foreign petroleum policy, a foreign policy that admits a, quote, "general recognition," end quote, of our foreign policy should be, quote, "equal opportunity for American enterprise and exploration for additional resources of supply of petroleum and in the development of whatever resources may be found in the future," end quote. In other words, American oil enterprises should have an open door policy of equal access to sources of oil and development of oil. How much oil? Well, until the rate of, quote, "exploitation will be adequate to the desired conservation of Western Hemisphere oil reserves," end quote. That's fancy language for we will keep exploiting foreign oil until we're satisfied. But as a report showed in a 1964 State Department document, the oil wasn't just about petrodollars or profit. The report said, quote, to preserve free world access to area oil supplies on acceptable terms. Although the U.S. is not itself dependent on this oil for its economic viability, Western Europe and Japan would face sharp economic dislocation, at least in the near term, if Middle Eastern oil were cut off. End quote. That is to say, while America doesn't need the oil because of its own oil production, if America has control over oil reserves in the Middle East, it gives America power over countries that need Middle Eastern oil. Japan and Western Europe can be manipulated because they rely on Middle Eastern oil that we have control of. In a State Department memorandum in 1945, Dean Acheson wrote, quote, in Saudi Arabia, ellipses, the oil resources constitute a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, end quote. So move over the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, the oil from oil-rich regions produces petrodollars and profit that make oil reserves great material prizes. However, it's also a stupendous source of strategic power because whoever controls the oil controls the region. In fact, policy planning documents for Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Near East, Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and Palestine all directly reference the source of material interest and strategic access each area provides the United States in terms of oil. The report on the Near East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa explicitly defined, quote, U.S. ellipses interests, end quote, are maintaining, quote, means of strategic access, end quote, and, quote, access to area oil supplies, end quote. Another U.S. interest was to, quote, protect U.S. private investment, end quote. This report goes on to explain that with military power, the U.S. can, quote, support its interests, quote, which is, quote, private commercial and oil enterprises, end quote. In fact, this is the international relations theory of Wilsonian idealism in a nutshell. Richard Alstein wrote about Woodrow Wilson's personal belief that, quote, since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financier must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. Colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. Noam Chomsky pointed out a crude version of Woodrow Wilson's words were given by Thomas Friedman. Thomas Friedman wrote in a New York Times article in 1999, quote, McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the builder of the F-15, end quote. To reiterate, the military is the arm of imperialism that allows us to maintain our empire and pursue material resources like oil. In National Security Council Memorandum 5820-1 in 1958, our, quote, Western interests in the Near East, end quote, are our interests of, quote, critical importance, ellipses, Near Eastern oil, end quote. It is, quote, of such overriding vital importance that, bracket, our interests, end bracket, must be achieved, ellipses, at the expense of others less essential, end quote. Once again, a big primary objective of U.S. foreign policy was and is, quote, vital free world interests in the area's petroleum, end quote. Former Director of Policy Planning for the State Department, George Kennan, wrote in Policy Planning Study 19 in 1948, quote, oil of the Middle East, ellipses, is important to U.S. security, end quote. In his 2006 State of the Union address, President George W. Bush said, quote, we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil, end quote. In a 1956 Plan of Operations for Latin America, one of our main objectives towards the Western Hemisphere was, quote, the protection of sources and processing facilities of strategic materials, end quote, like the protection of the rich petroleum services in Argentina and Brazil, two countries we have staged coups in, overthrowing their leaders with ones that will serve the interests of U.S. companies and the interests of the U.S. government. What I want to press upon the listener is that the empire presents itself in a certain manner. It acts like it cares about democracy, human rights, and raising the living standard for the poor. U.S. foreign policy pays lip service to democracy. However, as George Kennan pointed out in Policy Planning Study 23, those are just, quote, idealistic slogans, end quote. Democratization, raising the living standard, and human rights are things that you say to the people, propaganda you feed them. In Policy Planning Study 23, George Kennan wrote, quote, we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Ellipses, our real task, ellipses, maintain this position of disparity, end quote. To maintain this position of disparity, this obscene amount of wealth, the top planners in Washington have to dispense with notions of altruism and world benefication. Human rights, raising the living standard, democratization are, quote, unreal objectives, end quote. Those in power, those in Washington, in order to maintain this disparity of obscene wealth, quote, are going to have to deal in straight power concepts, end quote. This is what the empire hides in its discussion of domestic and foreign policy. It does not care about domestic and foreign human rights, democracy, or raising the living standard. Again, to reiterate, that's the propaganda it feeds the people, the general population. What the American empire and those in power, the ruling class, truly care about is the main objectives of our foreign policy. And the main objectives of our foreign policy is strategic power and material interests, oil and domination, oil and conquest. I don't know what I want to do with my life when I think about or when I have to face the realities of climate change and inevitable climate catastrophe. That's if the human species doesn't ruin the human experiment by blowing itself up with nuclear weapons. However, I know I want to spend the time that I have analyzing the American empire through media analysis. I've fallen in love teaching myself about the American empire and how it's presented through mass media. Now I want to pursue a doctorate on that same subject, media analysis and the American empire. But most importantly, I want to reciprocate the same feelings of adoration and captivation I have gained from teaching myself about the American empire, by teaching others about the American empire. I have yet to find a subject I have cared about more deeply than this one, the American empire, the way it's presented to the general population and to the world through the mass media. And most importantly, I have yet to find a subject I care more deeply about teaching others.